Welcome. So excited to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, Aarathi Krishnan. Aarathi Krishnan is the Senior Strategic Foresight Advisor for the United Nations Development Program, and she's an affiliate at Berkman Klein. She is also the 2021-2022 Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Harvard Carr Center for Technology and Human Rights. The focus of her research is on decolonial foresight and tech ethics in humanitarian tech governance. And I must say, we have a lot of enthusiasm for this topic at this conference. So I know many of us are really looking forward to your talk today. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Aarathi Krishnan. I don't have a presentation, so I'm just going to talk. And I do talk a little bit quickly. It's my Indian, Australian upbringing. So if I do, just put your hand up and tell me to slow down. Adrienne Marie Brown once said, "We are in an imagination battle. Imagination turns brown bombers into terrorists, white bombers into mentally ill victims. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of ability." She says, I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's capability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. How do we serve all of humanity without bringing the inequities of our past into our futures? This isn't merely an academic or a technical pursuit for me, but a deeply personal one, driven by the notion that it's often people that look like me, who come from the communities I come from, who are often denied voice. We are spoken on behalf of when it comes to the choices available to us for our futures. As complexity and uncertainty recasts our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world, it also does provoke new answers to the question, what does it mean to be human in these 21st century futures? The need to address these issues has seen a surge in the push for strategic foresight, to be anticipatory in the face of emerging changes and risks, to be long-term in our thinking and policy direction. Global governance of foresight and risk in practice attempt to blend imaginations of what the future might be with action in the present that requires changes in policies, practice, risk anticipation, decision-making culture, and investments that governments and multilateral institutions need to adopt. But these realms of imaginings and design of democracy, progress, social good, and what it means to thrive have traditionally followed a static, rigid view of these ideas, steeped in pillars of a northern-dominated world order. We limit the possibilities of what might evolve in our world to binary scenarios, as if these are the only things available to all of us, without considering the interconnectedness of risk and complexity that drive how human beings live. This very practice can be steeped in bias and surface level rhetoric without interrogating what is needed for us to change and adapt to an uncertain world. As a result, these futures can be mistaken as self-evident truths. And what is the result of futures that become a self-evident or singular truth? They result in policy design that is created with very narrow ideas about humanity. And when governance and risk design is designed in narrow streams, the poor, the uninsured, the disenfranchised, the information poor, the less mobile, historically oppressed, historically excluded, bear the brunt. So permit me to weave a story, a mosaic, of the impacts of colonization and its links to anticipation and foresight in governance and risk and crises. Global governance systems seemingly keep being taken by surprise, always a step behind shocks, conflict, new complex disasters, new types of vulnerabilities. The approaches remain the same, albeit touted as improved, but has it improved? When people continue to be left behind, when we don't see new types of vulnerabilities, when we are not prepared for new emerging crises, we assume our approaches, tinkered with at the sides, are enough to respond to anything that comes our way. But what we are facing in the next decade is not anything we have experienced before at the scale that we will be experiencing it. We are going to be experiencing compounding, intersecting systemic and existential risks. We are going to be experiencing the types of disasters and devastation at a scale that we haven't experienced. We are going to experience the types of wars that bypass our rigidly held principles, values, and rules that not necessarily everybody cares about abiding by. We are going to be experiencing the types of injustice, inhumanity, agony, and despair not seen in decades, perpetuating historical systemic oppression that already undergirds so much of humanity today. Looming larger than this is the resulting surge in uncertainty. As one example, in 2022, just a few months ago, the conflict in Ukraine, compounded by global events related to climate risks and food production constraints, led to heightened vulnerability in Pakistan across numerous dimensions, from severe wheat shortages to a reduced energy supply, and then devastating floods. Examples like this also underscore the reality that in the Anthropocene, the local is no longer local and the global is not just global, with patterns and processes that may rapidly disperse as a consequence of scale, connectivity, and speed. What this means is that a risk analysis framework for a policy or program has to account for not only the known variables, which is its traditional approach, but also for the unknowns, including the ways the outcomes of a local intervention may be influenced by and trigger effects in other areas and regions and across different timelines. In simpler terms, events occurring in one part of the world will have compounding butterfly effects in other parts of the world and manifest in unequal ways, particularly in nations that are already experiencing severe structural impediments to their own development trajectories. Our recent UNDP Human Development Report cited this year that the layering and interactions of multidimensional risks and the overlapping of threats give rise to new dimensions of uncertainty, if for no other reason than human choices have impacts well beyond our weakened social ecological capacities. These types of exponential, intersecting, multidimensional risks and uncertainties makes it almost impossible to assign accountability for mitigation measures and thus subsequently to govern. It means then that these manifestations are not priceable in our existing accounting methods, society, and economy, and thus get left ignored. How then do we price risks, these types of risks, to human life or planetary existence? Conversely, how do we price or value the risk of civilization breakdown, as Indy Johar argues? And when we can't price, nor govern, nor assign accountability to these types of risks and uncertainties, then now, as always, the historically oppressed and excluded continue to carry the brunt of impact. Bold action is needed, which includes the need for more anticipatory policy measures, meaning policy dynamism that anticipates and is proactive in assessing future threats and directing resources to mitigate associated risk. But the lack of such anticipatory measures points to the failure in our risk governance systems that are not equipped to deal with downstream accountability over multiple timelines. If the most fragile amongst us continue to bear the brunt of these impacts, our mutual ability to create norms of freedom, of thriving, fall behind. In clearer terms, if we still do not have the existing structural infrastructure and investments for existing risks, futures of compounding risks will most certainly impact our capacity to reduce economic and human suffering, and in fact, arguably could increase it. And despite widespread acknowledgement of the need for urgent action, we lack proven practices and experience in addressing these interconnected and systemic risks. Conventional risk management practices have evolved based, as we all know, learning from the past. It's not just that we need new technical approaches and assessment frameworks, but equally new paradigms through which to make decisions that balance current and future needs, particularly when dealing with complex and uncertain trade-offs. As costs compound and the landscape of risks evolve, so too must the ways in which we conceive of the values that underpin mainstream development models. For example, freedom, as the development philosopher Dr. A.K. Shivakumar has said, means protection from the risks that people experience every day. Yet freedom will also mean protection from the risks that people will experience in the future. So how might we better orient our decision-making frames and prioritization processes to navigate the needs and desires of both present and future generations? In UNDP in Asia Pacific, we are experimenting with approaches to anticipatory crises and risk assessments to get ahead of these fallouts. We experiment with blending a range of different risk indicators to provide a more holistic and contemporary view of crises. We do this by blending different economic, social, political, environmental risks, using horizon scanning and collective intelligence, but this in itself is not enough. Why do these frameworks continue to still leave people behind, as if the act of being left behind is an accident and not instead by intentional design of exclusion? And to understand why, we must look back at our shared history. I've often argued that our global governance systems perpetuate hierarchical, patriarchal, hegemonic views of what development and progress looks like, ignoring other worldviews and underlying systemic and structural pillars of inequality and bias. They were developed in imperial systems, meaning that our colonial legacies of the global North and the global South, in a way that allows supremacy and racial hierarchies to go unchallenged and to also thrive. The agonies that our world is facing today didn't happen overnight. It is the result of the shared history of colonialism, where solutions are always offered in the name and the good of those being colonized. It's part of modernization, of course, but they themselves are not recognized to be legitimately part of producing those solutions. The act of colonialism or colonization removes power from the colonized, dispossesses and transfers economic resources, and removes culture in the name of civility. It isn't just physical, it's also mental and metaphysical. Coloniality presents itself in a matrix of power that operates through control or hegemony over the economy, including land, labor, natural resources, authority, gender and sexuality, and subjectivity and knowledge. It was presented to the world as modernization, but this was at a grave expense to freedom, justice, equality, and resulting in a homogeneous worldview. The idea of modernity came as a result of this domination. How we then conceive and transfer knowledge, as well as what knowledge we see as credible and valid, are also based on these colonial beliefs. How we exist within these structures and how we interpret reality is deeply influenced by colonization as well. And all of these come together to create a narrative that defines how normal is understood. It isn't, and colonialism isn't the only privileging force that our global systems sometimes uphold. It also upholds forces like patriarchy, race and ethnicity, bias, paternalism, heterosis normativity, classism and class privilege, caste privilege, ableism, ageism. As Ruha Benjamin provokes, who and what gets fixed in place to enable progress? What social groups are classified, corralled, coerced, and capitalized upon so others are free to tinker, experiment, and engineer the future? To design anew, we must ask of ourselves what systems corral how humanity exists. How do they play out in people's experiences and why? Quite often, those that utilize anticipation and foresight approaches assume emancipation and liberation, but leave out a critical understanding of history, power, who is deliberately unseen or exploited. And without this analysis, the use of hegemonic foresight might paradoxically expose or expand harm on marginalized, minoritized constituents? How is the future talked about in vulnerable contexts, when people juggle crippling poverty or feel unsafe? In contexts where young people do not feel that they have full agency over their own decisions, where family, culture, and religious obligation play a greater role in how their lives play out? What about spaces where Indigenous culture and history were overtaken by capitalist labor markets of progress? Whose visions of the future ought to prevail? How do we talk about long-term possibilities when desperation is a fundamental baseline in people's lives? Do we consider these issues when we design ideas or solutions about the future? The practice of anticipation, of governance, of foresight, it's not neutral. It is conditioned by our positionality, cultural values, our economic systems, and our capacity for collective imagination. Are we chasing only one idea of what progress looks like? Do we end up replicating versions of ourselves or the stories we want to tell? It can frame our choices and help us choose the pathways ahead of us, yes. However, the more rigid our dependence, the finer the line becomes between foresight seduction and foresight coercion. We end up gently bending our choices, our perspectives, our sense of ourselves to fit these rigid frames, reducing the breadth of our humanity to those templates that are designed and understood by a privileged few. Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." What does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. To intentionally carve a different type of ideology would require systems that are informed by different knowledge sources that can tangibly influence decision-making and prioritize a focus not just on the firefighting of today, but rather the implications of a nuanced understanding of future generations. How might we embed plurality in governance and ethics that allow us to consider the connected tissue across political, infrastructure, and social threads, and that embed deeply affected values that frame an intentional equity impact? Instead of merely looking at governance in terms of control, could weaving in feminist and decolonial approaches help us liberate our future so that it is a space for humanity, of safety, of joy, for those whom we are meant to support? Are these approaches ways in which we can design a new forms of humanism? To do so requires us going beyond mere diversity and inclusion, or lip service nods to power sharing or being participatory. Feminist and decolonial governance is not just about the process of undoing and giving up social and economic power, but it is an aspiration to restore, renew, elevate, rediscover, acknowledge, and validate the multiplicity of lives, lived experiences, culture and knowledge of Indigenous people, people of color, and colonized people, as well as to decenter hetero-cis normativity, gender hierarchies, and racial privilege. I think of this as how we exist in plurality in a more ethical multiverse, so to speak. And to include this in governance, not as tokenistic of virtue signaling flag, but rather to help us consider different lenses, perspectives, sources of truth in even how we think about what is right, what is fair, what is just. It isn't just about getting underrepresented groups around the table, but rather how might we shift the knowledge and experiences we draw from in the design and decision-making of policy and governance frames. It is to ensure we are considering the multiplicity of ways in which issues of rights, ethics, agency, community are understood and experienced the world over, and not imposing just one or a narrow valued judgment on these. However, and notably, if one dimension of foresight pertains to considering the future and the well-being and interests of future generations, the other lies in reconciling with the reality that no matter how sophisticated the analysis methods or how intensive the investments, the future still remains unknown. Likewise, the experiences and desires of future generations, while possible to imagine, are impossible to know for sure. And specifically within these, the experiences and desires of different community groups, different constituents of future generations, are also equally impossible to know or imagine, let alone by those outside of those groups. No amount of persona methods can put us in the actual roots of lived experience in the current, nor in the imaginations of the future. This inherent tension does not negate the values of those efforts, which is ultimately derived from a combination of existing evidence and patterns, informed imagination, and abductive reasoning. Being anticipatory, in this sense, calls for enhanced capabilities and infrastructure by which policymakers and societies can exercise moral imagination and dialectical thinking. The transparency about how shared values are deliberated is also critical for designing risk mitigation frameworks, which calls for shifting away from the largely financial-driven premise of many conventional risk frames. With less risks that can be priced and crystallizable when thinking about long-term development trajectories, one needs to also talk about the price or value of a human and how to price risk to human life, or price the risk to human thriving and development. Without these shifts, these categories of risks and the non-asset owners in societies will remain largely ignored. So some examples of what a systemic decolonial and feminist approach could consist of. We move from tight circles of recognized expertise. Current foresight practice sees similarity in expertise and little recognition of non-academically qualified practitioners or people with lived experience. Cynthia Sellen puts forward the argument that foresight methods have their own schemes on what counts as anticipatory knowledge and specify through which channels such knowledge should be shared and generated. Can we move to recognizing positionality? When the same group of experts facilitate foresight processes and workshops, we continue the same epistemology of knowledge and learning. Whether consciously or unconsciously, we recreate in our own image. Recognizing the positionality of facilitation and decision-making within our wider metropolis allows an assessment of impacts and bias and privilege. Can we move from narrow epistemology? The frameworks behind what we use have hardly evolved over the last decades. The recent years have seen expansion of epistemology in terms of storytelling and concepts of time. It has not translated in a legitimate way to mainstream curricula. Can we instead move to legitimacy in plurivocality? Utilizing a wider range of knowledge sources and experiences legitimizes a multiplicity of conceptual models and prevents the replication of an echo chamber worldview via limited perspectives that do not account for normative, philosophical, and cultural realities. The addition of different epistemologies allows us to recognize that multiple truths and multiple realities can exist at the same time and are seen and experienced and imagined by different groups of people, even within similar contexts. Plurivocality gives socio-political and ecological momentum to affect relationality in literacy and challenges. As Arturo Escobar argues in Design for the Plurivers, we must liberate the imagination to enable other definitions of possible futures. Can we move from the 4 Ps of futures? Possible, preferable, plausible, and probable. Can we move to an expansion to 5 Ps? The 4 Ps are no longer adequate for 2 reasons. Its terminology is not necessarily easily understood by all peoples. And 2, it misses the additional layer of perspective. Whose perspectives do these 4 Ps privilege and whose might be dispossessed? Can we move from hegemonic language? We use the same language regardless of whether it resonates with people the world over, the same type of jargon, whether it influences their cultural mental models. The same terms are used to describe approaches and methods, regardless of whether it is understood or embraced, or even whether that term exists in other languages. When language and terms are not understood, it becomes a form of exclusionary privilege. Can we move to democratizing language? When the language of knowledge is so out of touch and out of reach for much of the world, and we dismiss people's ability to understand it, we fail to recognize the fundamental factors needed in democratization: resonance, understanding, and embracing. And finally, can we move from simplistic solutionism and constructed representation? Problem identification in futures and foresight approaches tends to be minimal, based on the perspectives of who is in the room. This often results in solutionism that narrowly focuses on what appears to be an obvious issue with some degree of certainty. Can we instead move to objective truth and relational ethics, where we assess patterns across a wider range of contextual, social, technical, economic, and historical systems, norms, and structures to understand why, rather than blindly and simplistically designing technical solutions or systems based on singular or similar representations? Hope is a radical act. It is what makes us cross seas, take risks, and jump without safety nets, when the journey and arrival might endanger safety and might diminish us. We are propelled forward by the hope for a better future for our children and our grandchildren, but hope by itself is not enough. We must translate this hope into action that befits the types of resets we need in the redesign of new commons, values, and wisdoms. Unsettling the coloniality of our governance systems is an act of resistance to the shackles that have held humanity back from evolving our potential of how we live with each other and with our planet. An act of resistance to the continued practice of designing for privilege rather than for equity and justice. As Bell Hooks so eloquently argued, am I educating the colonizer and oppressor class so they can exert better control? If we do not interrogate our motives, the direction of our work continually, we risk furthering a discourse on difference and otherness that not only marginalizes people of color, but eliminates the need for our presence. We are living in a time where choices are being taken away from so many of us. So as a brown woman, I stand here in front of you and say, the feminine is not dead, nor is it sleeping. Angry, yeah. Seething, hell yeah. To have choice and to have safety in making those choices is the cornerstone of freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Questions of anybody? I think we just have just about 10 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, I can run around with a microphone. There we go. See, look, here I go.
Hi, thank you for such an informative talk. Building on the title and the Audre Lorde quote that you read, I know this was not what you gave in your talk, but I'm just really interested in knowing, how do you imagine that Black feminist theory plays a role in decolonial tech?
Decolonial tech, yeah.
Black feminist theory fundamentally pushes that idea of one type of feminism, one type of normative ideas about difference isn't going to help all of us. That we need to understand intersectionality. We need to understand how it is understood by different groups of people, that white feminists are different from Black feminists, different from brown feminists, different from transgender feminists. How that impacts on how we understand the ethics of tech. Even the idea of ethics is a Western concept. It's rooted in this idea of logical and sound reasoning of individuality. It does not take into account, for example, what happens when your decisions are not informed by the individual, but informed by the community. It's not informed by things like community philosophies or different types of religious philosophies that inform our decision-making or how we interact with each other. So I do think that the principles put forward by Black feminism has a strong influence, not just the only one, but even how we understand how we make decisions around which ethics are right and which are fair for different groups of people.
Thank you. I entered the world of foresight exactly 25 years ago in Hungary, and I've learned a lot from Western European colleagues. And since then, I see a fight between different communities. As a footnote, I'm Hungarian. We have a song which says that words are dangerous weapons. So in other terms, terminology, language is really important, as you also stressed. So what I've seen in the last 25 years is that when foresight, the term, has become popular among policymakers, people from many other fields. So in my view, there are lots of approaches for prospective analysis. Foresight is one. And for me, based on my experience, mainly from Western Europe, foresight is participatory. So therefore, as you stressed later on in your talk, various perspectives by definition should be heard. But as you also stressed later on, it is very difficult to find the right methods for to give kind of equal footing for the different types of participants or representatives of different stakeholder groups. So I was very happy to hear that. So later in your talk, you also stressed that foresight by definition is participatory. What annoys me a bit is that in many fields, in many countries, in many communities of practices, foresight and forecasting, prediction are mixed. So that's why I started by saying that words are dangerous weapons. So thanks. That was an observation, not really a question.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. My question is about how we can create spaces for that plurality, and especially, what's the role of community? What's the role of festivals, of places and times where people can come together with positive emotions, have fun together? Sort of, what do you see as that positive kind of environment where we can embrace each other and collective visions of the future that might be more positive?
I think it's integral. I think we often, and I say this as someone that works in risk and crises and uncertainty, and my job is inherently sad, but sometimes we have lacked the ability to design for joy. And if we can center joy and care in how we think about designing policies, an example would be, do we look at livelihoods policies as merely being able to have a job? If we centered joy and care in the design of the policy, maybe the policy would be that we provide security and enough pay so that people can have one job that has dignity versus multiple jobs just to afford to go to the doctors. That people working in factories and production lines don't have to wear diapers so to prevent them from going to the toilet, but rather they can work in ways that promote their own dignity and agency. So I do think that if we can center joy and care, but it's really hard, and have that as a grounds in policymaking and decision-making, as well as in how we embrace happiness and connect with each other, it can help us reframe some of the decisions we make as policymakers.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. One of the most pernicious legacies of colonialism is the epistemology. Empires love to measure things and count things. So if we're talking about a new pluralistic way of doing futures, one of the great challenges is, how do we know it's working? how do we measure success? Progress, as you pointed out, is such a loaded word. And could you offer any examples? I think mentioning joy is really lovely. Maybe you've answered that part of the question. Can you point to any examples of what it looks like when this is working, and how do we know when it's working?
I can offer two examples. One is if we look at Indigenous protocols, particularly in terms of how they measure their Indigenous communities. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of Indigenous communities here. So if there's any Indigenous peoples in the audience, please step up. But Indigenous protocols offer a really great, what's the word I'm looking for, wayfinding in terms of how they measure how the well-being of their own communities. The second is actually a Brazilian philosophy called Buen Viver, that also offers a different measure of development progress. And I find this absolutely fascinating. And it was, again, I may get this wrong, I don't have the information at my fingertips, but Buen Viver was designed very specifically to contrast sort of Northern hegemonic development frameworks.
Is that working? Okay, perfect. So I have a question about just following up on that phrase that words are dangerous weapons, or maybe you could say dangerous tools. And I'm thinking about the word risk that you used and what's explicit and what's implicit in the word risk whenever it's used by these, by foresight or analysis, because risk also assumes sacrifice. So when you're calculating a risk, you're saying, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice this population, this zone, this material, et cetera, et cetera. And so the use of the term risk almost covers that up, because the risk allows you to project something like, we want this to happen, but what are we not sacrificing? And so maybe I was trying to think, like, when you're using these words like foresight and risk, those are kind of like the master's tools. And so what alternative terms might you wanna, use in these kind of frameworks that are both legible to a wide audience, but at the same time, don't leave some things that are explicit or that are implicit in terms that are kind of violent, excluded from the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that question. So I've been trialing different approaches, and for exactly that reason, using tools that within the constraints of the institutions I work within can understand, but doesn't promote violence is a great word. So one is often when we're talking about risk governance, we do not have a conversation about trade-offs. What are we trading off? Who gets traded off? What are we dispossessing? And so one of the things which I've had to do a lot of internal communication over is even including the word, if we make this decision, what are we privileging and what are we dispossessing? Who are we privileging and who are we dispossessing, and in which time frame? And don't tell me community X, break that community X down for me. It's hard. When we talk about the violence of these decisions about who gets not seen or continues to be historically excluded in the assessments, then our impact assessments also need to take that into consideration. So we're not just saying, let's do an impact assessment on X, and the impact assessment looks at, projections of economic breakdown or social environmental breakdown, but we're actually looking at what is the theory of harm that might impact on different groups of people within that constituency group over different points in time. And a good example, if you might allow me with this, in tech. When biometric identification was introduced, it was sort of heralded up in humanitarian aid as this is great, it's fantastic for efficiency, we're moving away from corruption and fraud, because the underlying baseline is that people that seek aid are corrupt. That if you give them cash, they're going to spend it on getting drunk versus actually putting food on the table. There's a whole problem there. But so let's put in biometric identity. But we made the assumption, or the technologists made the assumption, that whilst we here in the North might be okay with giving up biometric identification to get access to medical care or to go to the airport, that the same level of safety would be felt by people lining up for aid stamps in another part of the world. And the second part of that, nobody took into consideration that what would evolve from this technology is that biometric identification would be shared across borders. And when biometric identification is shared across borders, it limits the choices available to groups of people on the move because it then allowed for governments in one border to say, well, you crossed 2 borders before arriving here and we've got the evidence, so no, you need to go back, which is what we see now. So the future impact and implications, the future theory of harm that might emanate from a policy or design decision is not something we consider. We saw this in, I can talk about this for ages, so I'll stop in a minute. But when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, Afghans all over were desperately deleting their data and digital identity selves because they could be tracked down. Did anybody ever consider, and in the institutions and groups that I'm a part of, that this would ever happen? Was the unimaginable at the parameters of our frames of deductive reasoning, because again, we come from as human beings, a very normative, logical train of thought that could ever happen. Yeah. So in short, I fully agree. The violence of what gets excluded, and I love that phrase, is something we need to push more of. And I'll stop talking now, but you asked a very great question. Thank you.
I appreciate we're very short on time. So my practical question was what advice you might give to anticipation practitioners to facilitate real change. The point I think I'm trying to make, so I consider myself male, pale and stale, and the people I'm working with are of a very similar ilk. And so it's quite hard to get this idealism, this debate going with people like that. And I just feel to actually facilitate change, we have to live inside their worlds, the world of the enemy in a sense, as well as more idealistic vision.
I'm not sure asking for the solution from a brown woman for how to shift the perspective for white men is the answer. I do think that people in positions of privilege, and I recognize my own privilege. I was born in the South, but I live in New York. I've got a great job. I'm financially secure. I'm often called on to speak on behalf of all brown people everywhere. And I think part of this is recognizing our own privilege in the groups that we and in the bodies we, what's the word I'm looking for? We possess. So one of the journeys I've gone through over the last few years with members of my own community is, did we buy into the model minority myth? Did we sacrifice ourselves in order to fit in as a South Asian brown woman? So understanding our own privilege and what we need to give up, or our contributions towards the discourse or the practice, is a very personal journey. And I think that it needs to be done by members of your community. I know, what's her name? Jumana, do you remember her name? There's an amazing practice for white development practitioners to consider, that is being done by Elizabeth. I'll get the name, but
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, she reflects on people in your community.
Let's give a round of applause. On behalf of the organizing committee and everybody here at Anticipation, thank you so much.